Imagine project, and she is loyal to this forum. You can applaud her now. Thank you. So, under current circumstances, the least we can say is that it was quite something, quite a feat to organize this forum. Indeed, usually this forum is held in June after the commemoration of the D-Day landing. And of course, the sanitary situation prevented us from doing so. It was quite daring of us to plan it for today and tomorrow, the 1st and 2nd of October. But when you want to fight for peace, you have to be bold. And so we are delighted to see you here in such great numbers, following the sanitary measures and instructions for a great event, and with some exceptional people to talk about peace in the future. All of this only has meaning because you are present here today. So we thank you very much for having come, for having braved the elements. So far, the weather has not been too bad, and I would like to take this opportunity to welcome all those who are following us on social networks. We are streaming live on YouTube this year. Dear public, you can also send us your questions, whether it be through the social networks or by SMS. This works for the people here in the audience as well. It's the most efficient way of sending us your questions, and we have a moderator who will be taking your questions. And in as much as it'll be possible, we will be fielding these questions, and our speakers will be answering them. You know that the sanitary measures and instructions are strict. It's the only way it was possible to ensure that this forum would go well. We count on you. The main thing is to keep your mask on. I see before me an entire audience of people in masks, so please keep them on in almost all circumstances. No kisses, no handshaking. And it's hard for us to say this because a handshake is the most symbolic gesture of a peace agreement, of two countries, two friends who are going to be loyal to each other in friendship. So I would also, in this note, like to talk about an exhibit of Paris Match, which has a photo exhibit showing a very nice handshake. And this one has really touched me. It shows an intergenerational relationship, a veteran of the Second World War, and you know what that means here in Normandy, on the landing beaches. So a veteran who is reaching out a hand to Greta Thunberg, who is fighting on a daily basis for climate. And she won our Liberty Prize last year. It was one way to put forth youth. And I would like to say that we need to applaud, and we would like to have this youth applaud themselves. We want to hear them. Normandy for Peace. Normandy for Peace is an event which, first and foremost, is dedicated to youth. It is the transfer, or the relay, if you will, the relay baton of those who fought for freedom to those who now will have to endeavor so that we can live in a world of peace and be finally free. Frédéric spoke of the sanitary measures being taken, so I would like to very warmly welcome on behalf of the region all the teams that made this forum possible in extremely difficult circumstances. So I thank everyone. I thank all the services involved. Please, let's give them a warm round of applause. And when we talk about health, we also would like to pay tribute to all the medical corps. Yesterday, Barbara Hendricks gave a very moving concert for the medical corps in Normandy. It was a magical moment, talking about Martin Luther King, a road toward peace, and we and all the medical corps here were very, very touched. Barbara Hendricks has been the red thread of our 2 days of this forum, Normandy for Peace. She will also be at the forum this afternoon in Women and Building Peace. She is the godmother of the Liberty Award, awarded tomorrow. Now, Over the 3 years that this forum has taken place, there's been a continuity to explore all tracks that lead toward peace. So can you talk to us about the different themes we have broached? Well, with Bertrand Badi, who will be speaking later, and others, Antonio Opoza, we have wanted to have a red thread. And okay, there was the globalization of peace, new wars and new peace. Last year, the forum talked about the makers of peace. And this year, we're going to talk about preventing war and conflict and how we can address new threats, and to address this through plenaries and workshops. And also we have an evening this year. We will be talking about this topic of conflict prevention. So we have 2 days to really dig into this very important topic. So without further ado, for the official opening of this third edition of Normandy for Peace, please welcome the President of the Normandy region, Hervé Morin. Ladies and gentlemen, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, presidents of all types, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for having come in such great numbers despite the situation which we are experiencing today. It has now been 4 years that Normandy for Peace was created, and I must say that I still feel the same emotion at the opening of this new edition. Emotion on the one hand, because over these 2 days we will be broaching some of the most serious issues facing the existence of humans: life, death, giving of oneself, the upset of natural balances, displacement of population, attacks on men's and women's rights, and threats to democracy. And also emotion because of the faces I see in this room. Usually we have veterans who are together with young students or school children from our academy, and the last witnesses of 6 June cannot be with us today because of the risks that would be too great to their health. They cannot be here due to this virus, although they survived Omaha or in Utah. So we would like to pass a message to them through their families. We would like to thank the teaching corps and all the heads of establishments that have built pedagogical programs around this forum, Normandy for Peace. You see, Normandy for Peace is an event which first and foremost is addressing young generations. You are the depositaries of this forum. You are the successors of these veterans who, as children, not much older than you, went to the D-Day landing beaches to free our country and Europe. Thousands of them lost their lives, and fortunately, many of them survived to then be able to express the extraordinary courage of their comrades, but also to convey a message of freedom, but even more importantly, a message of responsibility. As the flame of their resistance, you must ensure that the flame of the heroes of 1944 will never go out, will never be extinguished. So I have emotion taking the floor before you, but I also feel pride because I have been elected over 5 years ago, president of the region, and with my also François Xavier Prilot, the vice president, we took the challenge of creating this forum to be a very significant place for discussion of sustainable development. And I would like to thank him and his energy and his intelligence for everything that he has been through and invested to make this happen. This struggle that I have wanted to wage through Normandy for Peace is something we've done all together, and we can all be very proud of it. Every year it is on a greater scale, it is stronger, more fleshed out, more global, with a greater number of guests, workshops, debates. And I would like to thank also the media, very involved in the program over these 2 days. So, after the great Normans who brought up matters of democracy, freedom, I'm thinking of Tocqueville, whose words remain so relevant today. I'm thinking also of Bernardin de Saint-Pierre and his Treaty of Eternal Peace, and Aristide Briand, the Pilgrim of Peace. And also there's Mendes France, the decolonizer. We also have moved forward on this road to peace, which they had drawn for us. We ourselves have begun to lay down the groundwork so that future generations can continue on this track. Despite the health crisis, Normandy for Peace is here. We have adapted the event to the rules, the health rules, and as Frédéric and François and Xavier have said, nothing would stop us from doing this, because we cannot skip a year in building peace. So I thank the organizers. I thank also all those who have made it possible to build this program, and I would especially like to thank 2 great academics. We have Yann Arthus Bertrand and Bertrand Badi. I also want to thank you for the work that has been done in very specific conditions, and especially, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the some 100 employees of the region that participate in this organization, and especially the European and International Affairs Directorate, including Julie Miclot, who even at 10 o'clock in the evening last night was still working. So I thank the entire team. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for having made this happen. So ladies and gentlemen, this year you see that the topic of our work addresses new threats, climate threats, social, technological threats, all these negative externalities of too much growth that is not respectful of man and the environment. We have always had the same objective, understanding war to better build peace. Now a few words on what we are going to be dealing with. Threats linked to the environment. The climate threat, we know, dear Nicolas Hulot, that this is a very crucial fact. This is a truism. And Donald Trump is about the only leader in the world who doesn't see this. It's almost as if the visor of his cap is just too low for him to be able to really see the horizon. For its part, the Normandy region, Nicolas and Yann, has been completely mobilized by having created its own Norman IPCC composed of great researchers of the region, and they will give us results in December of their work so we can draw conclusions to build the Normandy of tomorrow. Violent climate phenomena, diminishing water resources, advancing desert and climate disasters, as well as suffering of population. Since 2008, 25 million people have been displaced on a yearly basis due to climate phenomena. That is 2 or 3 times the number of displacements linked to armed conflicts or violence, much more than due to climate than to conflict. That would be like 1/3 of French people having to leave the place where they live every year. And I would add that these people facing from climate deregulation are the ones who are least responsible for it, because they're often the poorest. Half of the population living in what we call these low-lying coastal areas, those who risk being submerged in the short term are among the poorest of the world. Women, children, indigenous peoples forced to leave their homes, the place where they live. That is the human cost and the profound injustice of climate change. These climate displaced people are and will be the new damned of the earth. They are losing their security, but even more so, they are cut off from their culture, from their civilization at times. They are the new Harkeys of climate. And so they have to find a new space for themselves, a new roof. They are not awaited by anybody. Nobody wishes them to arrive, and they're often rejected as undesirable. Whence can emerge conflict, internal within one in the same country, or an interstate if these climate refugees have to cross a border. And then there is civil war. First, that can then lead to the participation of neighboring states and then major powers. It goes very quickly from local to regional and regional to international. The displacement for climate regions leading to conflicts and even ethnic persecution. Darfur is a good example of this, even if we can find many others. Pastures are transformed into desert, wells dry up, pastoral groups have to move. There is a fight over access to arable land and pastures and water. Ladies and gentlemen, beyond fighting climate or global warming and respect for the Paris agreements, we have here a topic that we really must address now, and that is to really recognize and establish a status of climate refugee within the UN, because no matter what happens, there will be several hundreds of millions of them by 2050. The Geneva Convention does not consider environmentally displaced people as asylum seekers because nobody is persecuting them. But we will have to fill this legal void quickly to prevent these newly displaced people so that they can be properly welcomed. The hummingbirds of the environment are also the hummingbirds of peace. An example of environmental threat shows that security in the classic sense of the term no longer suffices to guarantee peace. I'm even convinced that military expenditures, and I'm a former Minister of Defense, is not the best means for states who are investing so much in armament to try to ensure their own tranquility and security. Security must necessarily come hand in hand with sustainable development, with health, and respect for ancestral social structures, which is a factor of stability. We have to encourage investment in knowledge, fight ignorance, rather than just investing in nuclear power, in nuclear weapons, more investment in schools, universities than in military camps. This 1% of military expenditures, if that were to be spent on development, that would mean $20 billion, about $20 billion. I was looking at this morning, and that is twice the GNP of Niger, and it's the equivalent of Mali's GDP. And when we look at the stability and security of the Sahelian region, we understand very quickly that the French military presence there to avoid the worst, something that is necessary. For example, in 2013 that was necessary. But now it's not a solution because it's preventing a solution where these people could get access to education, to security, to have minimum protection, but also health, which would be the best factor, the best way of ensuring a balance within these nations and a capacity for them to embark upon the road to prosperity and development. So this has to be a central question that the United Nations must discuss on the topic of a bit of the military expenditures should be invested into development, and the world will be much better off for it. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is the message that I wanted to convey this morning. I simply want to conclude talking about the situation of women, which will be one of the focus points of our discussions. Conflicts are becoming increasingly internal and civilian, and women are in the tens of hundreds, sometimes thousands of these invisible, sometimes silent victims of these wars. And it's important, to my mind, to really put the spotlight on their situation. And I'm gratified by the fact that the Liberty Award has been awarded to a woman committed to human rights. Women are victims, but they're also there to shift the lines in law and constitutions in countries like Tunisia. We see that women have a central and major role in Tunisian society. In this respect, I would now, and this is how I will conclude, just a message of friendship, one of fraternity to a man who was present last year. He was present during the 3 days of discussion last year. He is a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He has talked about the threats facing women. This is Denis Mukwege, and so we are with you, Mr. Mukwege, Dr. Mukwege, in the DRC for what you have decried. So after these few words of introduction, let us begin the forum in earnest. Let us long live Normandy, France, long live the world, long live peace and democracy, which is so threatened today. Thank you very much.
Merci, cher Hervé.
Thank you very much, dear Hervé. So I declare the third edition of the Normandy Forum for Peace open. So, in this introductory speech, the President Hervé Morin talked about the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Dr. Denis Mukwege, who graced us with his presence at our forum last year. Please have a look at a few images that take us back to that visit last year. He was a fighter for human rights. He decried the massacres of civilians in South Kivu. Dr. Denis Mukwege once again is threatened. He's been getting death threats for what he has done, for his actions. His statement at the forum, World Forum Normandy for Peace is one more mark of his action. Peace has
du passé et que le pire n'est pas toujours loin du meilleur. Chaque jour, nous prenons conscience de la valeur de la vie et nous sémons les graines de lendemain meilleur. Chacun de nous peut être un faiseur de paix, puisque une façon de faire la paix, c'est aussi rompre le silence.
À travers ces images,
So, through these images, we see Dr. Denis Mukwege continuing his struggle on the ground, risking his life. He has taken positions even this summer that have led to other death threats. Dr. Mukwege is a peacemaker, and a portrait was attributed to him in our village. Dr. Mukwege is someone who needs support of all nations that believe in peace. And I think that the Normandy region must support him for his fight and for his security.
Et l'an dernier,
last year, we had 4 Nobel Peace Prize laureates. And they came up with a very special document, one that is in the continuity of the famous manifesto drafted by Einstein in '55. This is the Normandy Manifesto for Peace. It is a solemn declaration saying that the world has to step up to major challenges in order to really build lasting peace. This manifesto is one you can sign because it has no expiry date. Unfortunately, it is still relevant. Well, what does it talk about? It talks about these major challenges that we have to step up to for today's generation and future generations. And today, at the Village for Peace, you could add your signature. It is our roadmap, if you will, at this forum, Normandy for Peace, somewhat like the United Nations, which this year is celebrating its 75th anniversary. It has its roadmap with its sustainable development goals, and who better than its Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, to take the floor here to address you here at this forum.
Je suis heureux de participer au Forum de Normandie pour la paix dans une période aussi capitale pour la communauté internationale. La pandémie du Covid-19 a détruit de nombreuses vies et ébranlé les économies. Elle exacerbe et aggrave les inégalités et met à nu les fragilités du monde. Elle illustre également l'interdépendance des défis sanitaires, sociaux, économiques et environnementaux. La pandémie représente un avertissement sans précédent, une répétition générale pour notre monde. Nous ne pouvons résoudre aucun de ces défis, et notamment la crise climatique, de façon isolée. Plus que jamais, il nous incombe de coopérer afin d'apporter des réponses globales, solidaires et coordonnées. Mais la crise actuelle constitue également une occasion rare de réinventer notre modèle économique et social. Alors que les pays tentent de relancer leurs économies, nous pouvons accélérer la transition vers les énergies renouvelables et atteindre zéro émission nette d'ici 2050. Nous pouvons établir un nouveau contrat social et un nouveau pacte international pour une mondialisation plus juste, un partage plus équitable du pouvoir, des richesses et des opportunités et une gouvernance mondiale plus efficace. Mesdames et messieurs, alors que l'Organisation des Nations Unies commémore cette année le 75e anniversaire de sa création, nous sommes aujourd'hui confrontés à un autre moment fondateur pour l'humanité. Soyons à la hauteur et ensemble bâtissons un avenir de paix, de dignité et de développement durable. Et je vous remercie.
Alors, mesdames et messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, now we are going to get to the heart of the matter and address this morning's issues, the reasons of anger, the social, democratic and environmental challenges facing peace. The person who is going to present the general framework and make the introduction of this topic, of this reflection, is somebody who is very dear to our heart, a comrade of Normandy for Peace. He's a professor emeritus at Sciences Po, one of the best specialists in international relations, and is leading the scientific part of our forum with Nicole Nizono. And today he's publishing his latest book called Intersocialities. The world is not geopolitical. This book will be sold, and there will be also a book signing session later on. Let's welcome Bertrand Badi very warmly, please. So later on you can meet him at the pop-up bookstore at 12:30 after the plenary session. You have the floor. Good morning, Bertrand. I will start by saying thank you and congratulations to the organizers. Thank you for having such a strong willingness of facing up to all the hazards we have been going through in the past 6 months, and for really wanting to maintain this forum. What could be a better introduction or better presentation of what the construction of peace should look like today, a human and social will that you showed. I have the great honor, and I'm humbled to introduce the topic that was chosen, the reasons of anger, the social, democratic, and environmental challenges facing peace. And I would like to talk particularly to the young people, our student friends, those who will make the world of tomorrow, and tell them, really don't be reluctant to change everything in the way we see, understand, and build peace. We've learned that peace in many books from generations to generations. We learned that it was the business of states. This is no longer the case. Peace today is the business of the whole of humankind, of everybody. In other words, human beings, men and women, become the main players to build peace when they are not, unfortunately, sent to the world of suffering, violence, and hatred. The second challenge is that for centuries, imagine, for centuries, peace has not been defined. Peace was only the fact that you are not at war. It was non-war. It was the period between wars. Today, we must reach a positive definition of peace. And what I'm suggesting to you here is first and foremost to define peace as a social order, as a way of organizing humankind. The peace linked to high strategy becomes the central element of a sociological reflection about our world. In the past, peace or war, I should say war in the past was strategy. It was a competition, what the great philosopher Hobbes called the fight of gladiators. The war was coming from enemies, from neighbors. Today, most of the dialectic of war and peace does not come from strategy any longer, but from suffering. It is the social suffering that is becoming the arbiter, the referee of the relationship between war and peace. It is social suffering which today is becoming the major momentum of our international relations and leads the international agenda. And we know this suffering. We know that suffering produces all kinds of violence. It is food insecurity. Nobody talks about it. This represents 9 million dead people per year. Food insecurity represents the same damage amongst human beings as 9 daily attacks on the World Trade Center. Sanitary insecurity, of course. Do I need to add anything except that we should not forget something? If today we are deploring 1 million deaths because of COVID, in the past we had 450,000 dead every year because of malaria that nobody is talking about. It is also environmental insecurity. The Lancet says that it represents about 8 million deaths per year. Economic insecurity leading to poverty, individual insecurity leading to fear in front of oppression and dictatorship. Institutional insecurity that deprives individuals from the essential protection that institutions can give them, must give them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this social suffering, which is at the very root of all the destabilization processes in the international play, has a direct impact, as I was saying earlier on, or is actually a lethal phenomenon and leads millions of human beings to death, or it also has an indirect impact because it fuels new forms of war. The wars of the past are over, but there are new international conflicts in Africa and Sahel, in the Congo, in the Arab Peninsula, in Central Arabia or Asia. Well, these new forms of conflicts are not only between powers, even though they fuse them. It's new forms of conflicts that are derived from weaknesses of the economy, of the social connections, of the institutions, of social integration. This is exactly where the future of peace in our world lies. Now, what does this mean? It means that peace today needs a new form of solidarity. In the past, when there was war, people would invent or consolidate national solidarity in front of an enemy. Today, we need solidarity between all human beings, a human solidarity that we need to oppose to the challenges that the social sufferings I listed represent. We need to learn. It is absolutely vital to make a difference between the threat and the idea of an enemy. The main threat in our world today does not come from an enemy, a strategist, but from a systemic phenomenon in which you find all the sufferings that I described earlier on, because there is a constant interaction between food suffering, sanitary suffering, environmental suffering, economic suffering. They are crossing one another, and they are not reflected in the character of an enemy. They do not require human beings to fight one another, and they will find a solution, as the Secretary General of the UN reminded us a minute ago. They will find a solution only in the union of the whole of humankind. This form of international violence that we are confronted with today does not call for national mobilization any longer, but global mobilization of everybody. Now, this also means that the new peace will be built, as the UN Programme for Development stated so well. It will be built only against fear. Now, the nice report of 1994 of UNPD stated it very well. It said that peace means today to liberate human beings from fear, fear of hunger, fear of disease, fear of environmental disasters, of economic poverty, of what is arbitrary. New peace is the fight against all these fears. The enemy is fear, this fear that is derived from a social fabrication. It's not fear coming from somewhere beyond. It's the fear that we are making ourselves because we don't know how to organize, regulate our new globalized world. Now, all this means something that I think is absolutely essential. It's probably the most important part of the message I want to convey. In the past, international relations were settled by powers, and it was the balance between powers that made it possible to maintain a minimum of stability and periods between wars. Today, we need to change that. We need to move to trust. The regulating principle of international stability must be the trust that social players have one with the other. We need to build this trust. And I will conclude with what was the main term, the main word in this year's topic, anger. Anger is a very ordinary behavior of human beings when confronted with sufferings that are imposed to them. Anger is the social expression that is leading the world today. You were not kind enough to mention my latest book. If the world is no longer a geopolitical one, it's because it's not a policy that is leading the world. It's social elements. We saw that everywhere in 2019, Santiago, Beirut, Tehran, Algiers, Khartoum, Paris, Bogota, and in the regions as well. We saw that social expression has a capacity to lead the international agenda that politicians do not have any longer. Policies today were the hard part and social elements the soft part. Today it is the opposite. And very often now politicians are powerless, they are paralyzed. So the strength of this social expression, its force is that it gives us an answer. It echoes all these social sufferings that politicians have no control over anymore because all political systems don't work any longer. So international life is more structured, following the pace of societies rather than governmental choices. It means that peace is not a containment policy any longer. It's not any longer, as President Morin was saying, a policy structured around the military apparatus. It is a policy that can only built itself in restoring social justice and setting up a new international humanism. When you need to fight societies that are dismantling themselves, guns can do nothing. Guns can fight other guns. They cannot fight societies that are suffering and that are completely destroyed. It is this new page of a writing piece that we are going to write together in the next 2 days. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear Bertrand, for this very enlightening talk. We understand everything when we listen to you, and suddenly things that seemed complicated and obscure appear very simple after listening to you. I'd like to come back to the reasons for anger, and we will follow this leitmotif this morning. There is this notion of trust, but while we wait for trust, there is suffering. 4 kinds of suffering: the suffering of a continent, but also its hope. We all go through sanitary suffering globally today. There is climate suffering and also the suffering of societies and citizens. We've entrusted the difficult task of moderating these 4 discussions to a peerless journalist that the audience of France Inter knows very well. He's been working at France Inter for more than 30 years now. He loves nature and youth, and he has different programs. One that received the prize of the best program in the French-speaking community. Well, I'm talking about Denis Chessou. You can give him a big round of applause.
Ça fonctionne, c'est formidable.
It works great. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm really pleased to be with you today, and also to see so many young people in the audience today in the hall. And we are going to leave you a world that is working, and that's not an easy task. We know you're going to do a great part of this job. Bertrand Badi has talked about different sufferings, and we'll try to discuss them and try to answer the new threats. We need to be lucid. And I always remember this sentence by the philosopher Hannah Arendt, who said only action can save us. So clicking on the internet, social networks, all that is very nice, but it's not enough. At some point in time, we need to take action, and we need to do it all at our own level, which is very difficult. It's very difficult to feel that you are a citizen of the world at some point in time. It's not simple. Now, let us talk about these sufferings. I'm going to ask Nagale Bagayoko to join us, please, because you are a woman, a scientist, a political scientist. Now, of course, we are not close, so we can remove our mask to talk, but afterwards, don't worry, we'll put it back immediately, since half of human beings don't see one another, but yeah, there are smiles on your faces and in your eyes. I can see it in your eyes. Nagale Bakayoko is a political scientist, a specialist of Sahel. You created the African Security Sector Network. Now, let's review the sufferings of a continent. It's not easy. 1.3 billion individuals, 54 countries. It's called Africa, and a population that is even younger than you, because half the population is under 18. Now, the reasons of anger. Nyagale, please, can we start with the insurgency movements, and we'll talk about different things later on. Thank you very much, and first of all, I'd like, of course, to thank the Normandy region for their warm welcome. Congratulations for organizing this forum. I think that it's extremely important to realize that today the strategic environment in Africa is far from being able to be summed up by the need to fight terrorism. Of course, it is necessary to take into account all the jihadist movements that plague this continent, but it is necessary to understand things in a more sophisticated way, and in particular make a difference between the various jihadist movements, which do not at all use the same methods, in particular regarding civilians. It's also important to realize that these jihadist movements are more and more fighting one another, which makes the policies implemented to stop them much more complicated and difficult. But the security environment today on the continent is much more complex than that. You deal with many self-defense movements, community militia. You also see people's insurgency movements in Mali, for instance, after Burkina Faso. You also see the influence of criminal groups, traffickers, and the defense and security forces are also involved. Some of their units are violating the rights of civilians and attacking them. So you're talking about the sufferings of a continent. Now, we surfed on different shortcomings in the economy, in education, in democracy, and that made it possible for these movements to develop. Yes, I think this is crucial. We need to realize that all these forms of violence that we see in all the dimensions that I described, in fact, all this means all these people are calling into question the post-colonial states. They are growingly perceived as failed states in all respects, education development, urban development, so there was no benefit for the population. It's true. And in terms of security as well, the populations don't get the benefits of the state because they are felt as being predators and not protectors, whether we're talking about social security or economic protection. Now, there's also a huge gap between your standard of living when you live in cities or capitals and when you live in the country, in rural areas. What's important is to realize the difference in the situations prevailing in capitals or the peripheries of cities or rural areas. In major parts of the continent, in particular the French-speaking ones, you see whole systems of local governance that are not at all under the authority of the state. You have local systems of security that are private or belong to the community that are developing, but also systems that regulate locally resources and use them, that are under no state control, and justice systems that compete with legal justice. There's also a great deal of pressure on natural resources. And that's also essential. And we can also discuss this with the climate change. It's probably something else, but there's a link. It's an essential issue. The president mentioned the situation in Darfur and the competition between pastures and farming. It's something that we see everywhere in Africa, in Sahel, in Central Africa as well. And today maybe it is necessary to start again to think about this, not only in terms of geopolitics, but environmental policy. The power relationships between management of resources. Now, when we talk about migrations, what can we say? Like Hervé Morin said, in the future, tomorrow, there will be a wave of migrants. The 30,000 migrants of today will be, if I can say so, a very small number compared with what we are expecting. So what is happening inside the continent? Well, on the African continent, what's important to understand is that migrations are within Africa. We were talking about Burkina Faso. There are more than 1 million displaced persons from Burkina Faso, more than 500,000 people in less than 1 year. It's a considerable number, and the internal and external migratory pressure between African states is a central element in their policies. It's more important than regulating migrations towards Europe. Now, there is something that is very dear to your heart. You are a specialist of security. Now, what does it mean that it's necessary to develop an African perspective on security issues? Well, today I think that what prevails in Africa is mainly an imported conception of security. It comes from abroad. It's an interstate approach. It's very clear when you look at the doctrines, the operational doctrines, but also an approach that was inherited from the fight against guerrillas, low-intensity conflicts, insurgencies. And today we realize that they cannot face up to the type of conflicts that we have in Africa today. If we remember if we talk about the fights that cause a great deal of death in Africa, we think about Verdun. And, there is a history of the continent. There were empires, and it's important to refer to that. African forces have also more experience. They've participated in peacekeeping operations. We need to build on their experience. They also participated in national operations. We need to make sure that the players are not only states, but also the civil society, decentralized authorities as well. And we can also talk with our international partners to redefine a new approach of conflict management. Now, in the reasons of anger, and it affects us all, it's our gay virus. Now, what happened when COVID-19 started in Africa? We know that the population is much younger. They probably resisted better. They have been used to other pandemics in Africa, which is not necessarily the case on the continent, on our continent. So what happened? There were fears, and now what are the facts? Well, I'm not an epidemiologist, of course, but I think that there are two important elements. First, the pandemic did not have an impact on the security situation in Sahel. We had announced that the jihadist groups would use the pandemic. It did not happen. The international forces had some cases, but it was not the disaster that had been announced. But we realized that African governments, which governments can be criticized in many respects, were extremely efficient and showed responsibility that surprised a lot of their partners, including those that were helping them and assisting them. So I think it's interesting to look at the experience of Africa in the field of management of epidemics and pandemics. pandemics. Thank you, Nyagale Bakayoko, about these facts regarding the sufferings of a continent. We wanted to start with this continent, which is our neighbor, because we have a common humanity, and Africa also has a history. I wanted to recall that now. Sanitary suffering, we have a direct link here with Arnaud Fontanet, who is an epidemiologist and researcher at the Pasteur Institute. He's also a professor at NAN, the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers. He holds the chair of Health and Development and a member of the Scientific Council in the French government. A great task. Thank you for being here.
Alors nous sommes donc
So we are gathered here and in touch with you by video. So what does this pandemic reveal about our selfishness? What could it reveal? Well, this pandemic, I would say, has shown us the best and the worst. So in order not to start with the worst, national selfishness, I want to talk about the best. That is the incredible, remarkable role of our medical corps. It has been really a determining factor in the care given. They have provided help on a daily basis, and something that maybe is not emphasized enough. There's also been demonstration of individual solidarity. Elderly or isolated people had to be taken care of, and this was at a very local level, but it was nevertheless outstanding. Now, to come back to your question on national selfishness, what we have seen, we've seen the worst of what we could imagine, looking at the battles that took place around the, let's say, the stocks of masks and of tests. In February, there was this shortage. There were some, reactive agents used by certain countries, whereas the situation wasn't yet critical. And I think that unfortunately, this is, a part of human nature that surfaced. And I would say that above and beyond this national selfishness, there's individual selfishness, because we're facing a disease which is infectious, therefore transmissible. That means there are choices to take in terms of the considerable economic impact that this can have on society. But also, we have to consider ourselves as a possible part of a chain of transmission. I have heard people say, well, why don't we just, isolate the, let's say, the elderly, people who have comorbidities, people with high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, etc. Well, I think that this is something that is totally unacceptable from an ethical point of view. We would be breaking intergenerational links, which is at the heart of our society. And I'm an epidemiologist who is saying this. If you let this virus circulate freely, it's going to just get out of control. That's what we saw this summer, especially in many countries of the north. It circulated freely among youth during festivities, which we can see, and we saw that it also reached older populations that wanted to protect themselves but were not able to do so. And that's what we see in France, where there's a crisis, where we have more people in the hospital and reanimation, and because we see that it's the elderly who suffer most. Now let's talk about Europe. That is a great invention at the outset. How did it react? And there was a clinical platform that already existed, and this platform was to work together. And yes, people, let's say in Europe, we were all saying each for himself or herself. So what can we hope for the future if we have other pandemics? Well, we saw how difficult it was, even if we're talking about the European Commission or the World Health Organization, to, let's say, establish leadership. Because of national selfishness, there are local crises, or, for example, initiatives that you have mentioned. We've been seeking to create these within your multi-centric networks where we have, let's say, urgent situations, if a crisis emerges, these things emerge, let's say, about 15 million euros every, let's say, 4 years. And in this pandemic, it did not work. Every country sort of closed in on itself, did its own trials, and the recruitment was far under what it should have been. There were technical or technological reasons. There were some statistics gathered. Now there's been some readjustment within the World Health Organization. It's called solidarity, which is enabling us to move forward in a grouped matter. But it's been hard for these organizations to set standards. To know, for instance, if we wear masks, let's say because of aerosol risks, some countries could take measures to face the progression of the disease, like the CDC. We were expecting some advice from it, but they had a hard time coming up with this advice because things happen so fast. The northern part of Italy just was up in flames with this virus in a few weeks. And so countries themselves decided, and then there was a domino effect. We all copied our neighbors saying, oh, if we don't do what the neighbor has done, if things don't go well in our country, we will be criticized. So it's this whole way we responded to the crisis that was chaotic. We have to anticipate future crises. Okay, let's talk about it. How can we equip ourselves for the future? What could happen? Do we have to have, let's say, a dress rehearsal for a tropical disease that could emerge? This might not be totally revealing of a modern world, this crisis, because there have been others like the Spanish flu. It didn't take the plane, but it got where it was going. So, what hope do we have? What lessons can we learn? Well, the dress rehearsal was the SARS epidemic in 2013 in China that spread to 35 countries. Thankfully, people showed symptoms a few days, and there was a faster ability to cut the transmission. For the thing is, with this virus, people are contagious before any symptoms. But in 2003, we realized we had to be much more practical, less philosophical. We know that all pandemics mean the first stage is to have diagnostics tests in order to identify patients, to sort them, to say, okay, this person is infected, contagious, and must be isolated. This other person is not, can continue a normal life. This capacity to have at the European level diagnostics done, if it could be centralized so we could pool our efforts and roll out the tests urgently where necessary, instead of each country in his corner trying to do things as we've done this time with tests. And unfortunately, there was a lot of delay for many countries. So I think here we could make progress. Other progress in this crisis period, we need stores of things, for example, masks, respirators, and these stocks. If we were to try to have all equipment for all possible threats, let's say if there'd be hemorrhaging, we would need a blood bank. So we can't necessarily have stores of things for all possible crises. So why not have a European level pooling of stores so things would not be expired, things could be deployed locally at a given point. That way we could have economies of scale and probably react much faster. Now, you talked about the respirators. There are African countries where you have only 1 or 2 respirators. The link was made earlier to this. Now, a few words on what happened. The starting point. We did waste a lot of time. There were Chinese pulmonologists who were not very worried. Recall there was a whistleblower who had some minor problems. Here again, what could we hope for so that things would, let's say, work out better the next time? Well, that was one of the lessons of SARS. It was a revision of international regulations obliging all countries to very quickly declare any health crises. And here there was a delay. Why? The Chinese authorities let it be known that there were a few cases of this atypical viruses. And they said there were a few cases of medical staff showing that it was a human transmission among humans. There they already knew there could be a pandemic. That would have been precious aid. Would that have really been a game changer? I'm not sure. But they knew that there was a very high level of possible transmission. Here, we could have, let's say, gained a few weeks, and I think we would have been better ready to face the virus when it would come. And I think, again, about the tests. We were perhaps better than in some countries with regard to the capacity of the tests. But if in China, where the first hotbed was declared, we could have reacted better. Now, our scientific director, I would like to thank you on this. I must say that I'm very delighted to hear these two statements. They put the finger on two very important elements. What Professor Fontenay has just said is that we must absolutely change the software. That is, this new way of thinking about a threat. It's global and not local. The drama of the 6 months we have lived through. Everything was constantly being renationalized in each country, depending on software that belonged to an obsolete period. It's very hard to think about this notion of global security, to really think about how people, react. What are the reflexes? It doesn't mean to close borders. It doesn't mean close better than the neighbors. It's not to compete with the neighbors, but it's to do things really together. And it is this building of global security will be the major challenge of generations to come. And that's a very important point. And as always, I was delighted to hear Nyagale Bagayoko saying something that shows that the heart of uncertainty is in the decomposition of societies. Where societies are strong is where they have a strong ability to protect themselves. And at that point, this reflex of peace will become economically useful. So we could consider that these well-structured societies have a vested interest in building peace. So as soon as we're in this reasoning of social decomposition, globalization makes this let's say, a lasting hotbed of a conflict. The conflict in the Congo is 60 years old. In Somalia, 40 years old. In Afghanistan, 45 years old. So, through the decomposition of societies, we're creating a new type of society, war societies. This is a pathology of globalization. They live for war and through war. And the height of cynicism, war is supposedly a mechanism to protect society. Why do you think there are so many child soldiers in Africa? It's the only opportunity for youth without jobs. So you're 20 in Niger, you can either go toward migration with the risk of drowning in the Mediterranean, or you join a militia. Thank you, Bertrand Badis. Now, Nyagale, could you say a few words before we go on to the next suffering? Well, first, I'd like to say that I am delighted that this whole idea of the social contract has been brought up by the two statements made, because I think that we do indeed talk about the need to restore the capacity of a state, but now we're talking about something altogether differently. We're talking about something that's intergenerational. It's a community, it's maybe related to a religion or political. This is essential and requires a new type of thinking and discussion, not just thinking of a state and we have to really think about this intersocial type of relation. Thank you. I would ask that you now leave the podium, because please applaud Arnaud Fontanet and our other speaker, Niagale. Believe me, it is not hard. It is not easy to be a member of the Scientific Council today. We know that very well. You need to be diplomatic, and you need to have many, many qualities. So other suffering. So we have Nicolas Hulot, and I would ask that Gian Ganan come up on stage. Galit Keenan, rather. Galit Kenan is the director of the Jane Goodall Institute here in France. I don't know where you are. Oh, where would you like to be? You can have a seat here. No problem. All is going very well. So we have invited wonderful people. We have, let's say, been able to get this virus out of the woods. And so we have a video with Jane Goodall. But before that, thank you very much. The preceding speakers have done a great job highlighting how much health, economic, social indicators are all interrelated. But we want to come back. I want to come back to the causes of the pandemic, because it's the result of our actions, how we treat animals and nature. We are destroying forests and natural spaces at a terrifying speed. And this fragmentation and reduction of natural habitat has created all conditions favorable to animal diseases, and 60 to 70% of these diseases are related to animals. So we humans think we're not linked to what is other living beings, as if we live outside nature, and even this to our detriment. Yes, you have this concept of one type of health, the One Health it's called, and this also brings together animal, plant health. Yes, indeed. And if everything's interconnected, it's true that this pandemic, this period is reminding us of this. That's why the Jane Goodall Institute is a place where we are working for protection and respect for animals, and we want to put people at the heart of this conservation project, because it is by respecting every part of this whole that we will be able to fight for a more balanced type of existence. And in order to protect something, you have to know it. In order to love it, you have to know it. So we mentioned youth, who are very numerous. They've been gathered by the region. They have become informed, have been acting with empathy and compassion, even if this is a very anxiety-creating period. Many initiatives have been taking place, altruistic ones, generous ones, and peace, which is the whole goal of our forum, is not just an absolute or remote, lofty ideal. It's a way of acting on a daily basis. And I hope, and I'm convinced, that Jane Goodall's message will give you hope. Thank you. Thank you very much, Galit Kenan. Here are the few words of this ethnologist, anthropologist.
Hello, this is Jane Goodall, and first of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this really important Normandy for Peace initiative. Let's face it, we're going through pretty dark times globally right now. There's armed conflict in so many countries. There's violence, there's domestic violence, there's discrimination, and prejudice, and it's not a very peaceful world. Even talk of nuclear war, something I never thought could happen again after Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and pray God it won't. And then there's the violence against Mother Nature. As it is, we're destroying forests, we're polluting the ocean, we're covering the precious land and soil with chemicals in our industrial farming. On top of everything else, right now, we're tackling a pandemic. And this pandemic, COVID-19, has caused so much suffering around the world. So many people have lost their lives, their loved ones, their jobs. There's economic chaos everywhere. But let's realize that at the same time, underlying this pandemic, there's an even greater threat to our future, to the future of life on this planet, and that's climate change, the climate crisis. And again, that's due to our disrespect of the natural world. We're using the finite natural resources of the natural world as though they're infinite, but they're not. There'll never be peace on earth unless we also live in harmony with nature. There'll never be peace on earth until we learn to respect each other. So should we give up? Some people have said, well, you know, we've reached a tipping point, the point of no return. Absolutely not. We've still got a window of time to fight these things. And if we all do our part, each one of us, we can indeed make the sort of change that we need if we care about the future of our children. I'm involved in this program, which I began in '91, the Jane Goodall Institute's Roots and Shoots program, now in over 65 countries, young people, kindergarten, university, everything in between, growing all the time, hundreds and thousands of young people, many people who've been through the program and maintain the values. What are the values? That every individual makes a difference every day, and we get to choose what sort of difference to make. And every group chooses projects to help people, projects to help animals, projects to help the environment. Far more important than the color of our skin, our religion, our culture, our language, our country, is the fact that we're all human beings. That is perhaps the most important lesson for us to learn if we want peace on earth, to respect each other. I carry around with me a bell. It's not very beautiful, is it? But it's made from metal, from a diffused landmine, a landmine that was detected by the so-called hero rats, giant forest rats from Africa, who are trained in Tanzania to detect landmines buried under the earth because of their amazing sense of smell. These hero rats have helped to clear Mozambique, where landmines have been left after a civil war. Hope, if we all get together. But it takes all of us. Each one of us has a role to play. Each one of us can do our part to make a more peaceful world, a world that we can more happily leave to those that follow, a world where every living thing is respected. So I hope that this Normandy for Peace initiative is very successful this year. It's never been more important. We've never needed initiatives like this more than we do right now. Good luck to you. Have a successful meeting. And don't forget, you make a difference every single day.
Merveilleuse.
A marvelous woman who is 86 years old, and we heard her very soft-spoken manner. She is not the first. She was the first to tell us about chimpanzees, but that wasn't a topic. She says that, yes, we have a small window, a peaceful one, so it depends on each and every one of us. You youth, you're not going to, we hope, repeat or resume the mistakes that the older generations have made. So there is something that is still possible, and that we have to bear in mind. We must not sort of give in to this very negative feeling of fatality. You have to leave here with a knapsack that's full, it's heavy, yes, but there are many things that you have to do. Jane Goodall has said it perhaps better than I did. You can dream, of course, of one day going to Mars. That's great as scientists, but we won't necessarily want to go and live there, so we don't have a plan B yet. We will try to, do things in such a way that we will all have a livable planet for everyone. And we're talking, we're part of what is living. It is our job to preserve what is alive. This is ongoing work. Bertrand, would you like to add something? Well, I will try to play my role. What is great is that this house is being built brick by brick, and we always see things ever more clearly. And what we have just been shown, and this was a very strong point, until recently, and some are still in this kind of very frontal type of culture. That means that we think of competition, of adversity, and this type of confrontational or frontal approach often leads to confrontation. There's just a step between the two. But the confrontations, besides the ethical considerations, has no efficiency. You know that since the 40s, we don't win wars. There are no longer any victories. You've noticed that some think that a new Battle of the Marne in the Sahel or elsewhere will resolve problems, whereas that is not. It's not a Battle of the Marne that's going to solve problems in the Sahel. We need to look at the social aspect. We have to not look at the social side as something trivial. This social approach is very important, and we will develop this topic. That is the new type of peace. That's it. Thank you, Bertrand Badi. Now, somebody whom you know, we're going to have Bertrand coming up, but now I will ask Nicolas Hulot to come up onto the stage. So we have washed our hands with hydroalcoholic gel. This is a new word in our vocabulary. We're all used to it now. So this is very interesting because Nicolas began as a photographer. He knows photography well. He knows Africa well. He's been there many times. And through his travels, environment has become part of his life and has given a total meaning to your life. And you were one of the first to say at COP21, because we're talking now about climate suffering. You made that link between climate change and conflicts. You have the floor. First of all, I would like to warmly greet the entire audience, and I want to thank the Normandy region for having given us this opportunity to meet. Yes, indeed, in the period that preceded COP21, I had brought together a certain number of ministers of the defense from various countries to link the environmental cause to geopolitical relations and consequences. And what I want to say here, if you would allow me, is that you mentioned 4 types of suffering. I'd like to add a 5th. For me, it is one which endangers peace. It is humiliation. Why? Because you have to understand the world as it functions today. Why has this game changed? Because a world with solidarity is no longer an option. It is a condition for peace, because through technology, by what we call globalization, we have connected the world. This is a major step. But we did not take the second step. We didn't link the world. We just connected it. So by connecting the world, we enabled every single person to look at the entire world without any filter, to discover the reality of the world and discover also inequalities, and to discover simply that in determinism, at this point as I speak, the personal merit for an individual counts for only 10 to 15%. But the quality of living of the person depends on where that person is born and the family in which a person is born. And in this internet update or through phones or different screens, we see these big differences, and you add to this inequality an exclusion. To add to that, you add humiliation. Why do I begin with that comment? Well, you talk about the environmental crisis, which has two main elements. There is the rarefication of resources. So that means when you go from rarity to a deficit, we've gone to war over religions, over borders, over ideologies. But what will happen when fundamental resources, just as like arable lands, water, will be lacking? That is a scenario that's not so far away. The second component of the crisis, brought up by most of you, is the climate crisis. And the climate crisis, in terms of its consequences, is the justice of too much, this humiliation one step too far, because the consequences of this crisis take different forms. Multiplication of climate extremes leading to fires, submersions, or as we've heard, desertification. As Hervé Morin had mentioned this. This is meaning that people have to go take a tragic exodus. The current consequences, not to speak of the future ones, they are affecting women, men, and children who are being subjected to the consequences of a phenomenon that they have not created, an economic model that they have not benefited from. And, I'm sorry for saying this, it's something that was done, let's say, on their backs and to their detriment. And this is just unbearable. And if we don't become responsible, this will be absolutely unbearable. So to say things differently,
Le temps est venu d'assumer.
it is high time to take our responsibilities. It's the reason why, and I'm going to take an example. When a woman in Africa, just to take an example amongst others, and it's the case of thousands of them every day. Well, suddenly, through the internet, through the testimony of somebody who has traveled there, she suddenly discovers that her child is going to die of a disease, and the remedy is somewhere else, sometimes just across a river, a border, or an ocean. But because she was born in the wrong place, what she was thinking was simply fate, fatality, which was creating a kind of tragic resignation. Suddenly, she discovers that because of globalization, it was possible to import Coca-Cola bottles in her village, but not a treatment against malaria. Well, this is not compatible with a peaceful world. And this fact that I'm not the only one to mention, of course, but it's very important because it means that the world of cooperation that you are mentioning, rather than a world of competition, a world of protection rather than a world of predation, a world of solidarity, to be simpler, is not an option any longer. It's not an option any longer in a world in in which all indignities can be seen and all inequalities are becoming worse. So nobody will be able to desire to live in peace as long as such inequalities will continue to exist. So we are condemned to build a world that protects and shares, not a world that loots, that is a predator world where 1% of the people capture 93% of the wealth, not a world in the economic model is depleting a substrate upon which all our economic models are based. So let's see the obvious. The world of tomorrow that we are talking about so often will be radically different from the world of today, whether we want it or not. And I think that here we've decided to define and build a future rather than be subject to it. Thank you, Nicolas Hulot. Dear Yann Arthus-Bertrand, please join us. The man who created the Good Planet Foundation and has sent us many pictures that have made us thought, and the man who is not here today, Pierre Radan, said something very nice. He said that what we needed to do in the 21st century could be summed up in one sentence: how to be at peace with your planet and your neighbors. Now, of course, you need 10,000 pages to explain all that. We have different cultures and aspirations, different types of development, but we can remember that sentence, I think. Yann and Nicolas, you can talk whenever you want because you know this business quite well. Now, as we asked before, how can we free ourselves from the fears of tomorrow? Of course, today we have the risk linked with climate, the sufferings linked with climate. We're not going to bore you with figures, but the system suffers for so much inertia that all the improvements that we can come up with will be there only for your children, the children of those who are in the room today. Now, we should not be defeated, of course not, but the system has become crazy. We've completely disturbed the thermostat of the planet. How can we free ourselves of this, from this fear of tomorrow? Because it was said previously that we need to eradicate fear and replace it with trust. Dear Yann, first of all, thank you, Nicolas. I think that you are amongst the best of ourselves. You always have the right words, very strong words, and you speak as a human being, and we are all supporting you. It was necessary to say that. I'd like to add a sixth pain or suffering, maybe, which is the fear of the future. Today, all of us are worried. Who is not worried about the future in this room today? Who is positive about what's going to happen? When I was 20, nobody was afraid of the future. We were full of hope and of optimism. Today, all the scientific reports, what happened this summer shows us that today the climate in 10,000 years, this climate that has led us to build our civilization does not exist any longer. Scientists tell us this stable climate will never come back. This stable climate on which we based our civilization, found our food, built our cities will not come back. There is no reset button. And how can we live with this? And all the young people who are here that we see every day with Nicolas, I'm sure Nicolas does as well. I talk with young people every day who tell me, what can I do with my life? How can I make this world a better place? And everybody wants a better world. It's a real worry, a pain that is real. For 10 years now, young people, the young people we meet are very worried. Even their parents or grandparents are worried. So what's going to happen? What should we do? I don't know. It's an impossible question. Nobody can answer this question, but at least we need to take action. Taking action makes people happy, to love, to share, to change the world in any way you can, whether you're a journalist, an academic, a baker, an architect. Everybody can do it, can participate. Everybody can do something. I think this era, more than before, can help us give a meaning to our life. Life in itself has no meaning in itself. Only you can give a meaning to life. You choose to give it meaning. And this period allows us to do it. Now, Sébastien Bolet says that in our brains we have something which is called striatum, which is the place where you always have something more, and we need to regulate it. We are animals, but we are capable of inventing arts, science, and compassion, but we are not able to cross the limits today. So, dear Nicolas, there is a question we can all ask ourselves today. Our actions in the best possible scenario are going to represent 30% of a solution to the problem, which is important by the way we make purchases, what we do on a daily basis, what we don't want any longer. We can refuse to buy a lot of products. We have a great deal of power. But the question is, what is not working today in democracies? All our elected officials everywhere in the world, they have all the necessary speeches on these issues. They make speeches, but then they don't take action. And you've seen that, you've experimented that. Maybe before I answer this question, and I will modestly add something to it, because yes, the question is worth being asked. Why is our democracy so affected by the intrusion of long-term challenges and universal challenges that you are mentioning now? Of course, we can blame politicians, but it's very simple. It's too simple. Because beyond the human qualities that politicians have or don't have, all politicians has a narcissistic desire, which is to be re-elected, of course, and therefore to meet his or her promises, and therefore to improve the daily lives of the citizens. So in order to not oversimplify, we could try and understand what does not work in this system. What leads to the fact, as Einstein was saying, that our era is characterized by a profusion of means and and a confusion of intents. Now, are we able to come up with a collective will and be intelligent and, really get rid of technological principles and not wonder whether technologies really makes human beings fulfill themselves and pay for everything we can pay for? Are we capable of redefining the end and the means? What could this world of tomorrow look like if it brings about a compatibility between ecological, economic, and social challenges? But maybe we should use a word that we don't use any longer. And I'd like to quote Teilhard de Chardin. He used to say, when we will have used the energy of the seas, the energy of the sun, the energy of gravity, the energy of the marshes, well, we'll use a renewable energy, which is the energy of love, and we will have rediscovered fire for the second time. Now, it might seem a bit crazy, but when we see all the confrontations, all the conflicts that happen because of futile things, Martin Luther King was saying, we are condemned to add up our intelligence or die, or to die, all of us together. Are we all able to forget about these daily confrontations, make a difference between what is essential and superfluous, and really target our efforts towards what is virtuous and not toxic in a different way? If our democracies don't know how to combine the short term and the long term, what economists call the tragedy of horizons, I'm going to take a very simple example. when I was, for not much time, but when I was minister, if I was looking at the long term, you had to give a price to carbon. If I was looking rather at the sufferings of the short term for certain people, you had to decrease the price of gas and not have a carbon tax. It's very difficult to look at the short term and the long term with the same pair of glasses, because you have a fuzzy, vague vision in that case. So it's the whole difficulty of the exercise of democracy. So we need to do this peacefully, have information, and plan the future, because very often we know what we should do, but we don't know how, because we have no method. And there's a number of goals that we need to achieve that sometimes we've set for ourselves, but we don't give ourselves the means to reach those goals. With the legislation in particular, if you want to organize a major mutation, we need three principles. The first one is to be able to forecast. At COP21, for instance, we had the goal of carbon neutrality in 2050, but not in a binding manner. There's always a doubt, but we think we will probably be able to avoid this. The second principle is the irreversibility of legislation, so that ups and downs in policy, in elections, does not call into question the goals, because constraint is not the enemy of creativity, but its very condition. And the third principle is progressivity, because all change creates winners and losers, and you have to target the losers and do everything you can, have the necessary investments and scientific research to organize change, so that nobody is left on the side of the road. Now, when I was minister, we prohibited the use of neonicotinoids, which is a pesticide that kills bees, unfortunately. So we prohibited that, and we did not think about the economic and social consequences on farming. But what did we do? Did we ask our research institute on agriculture? Did we ask INRA to really look at shortcomings or problems, and it applies to glyphosate as well? We did nothing. And 3 years later, of course, in some branches, beet, for instance, we've reached a stalemate. So this applies to the general change that we need to set up as well. Last point, in our democracies, there's a kind of misunderstanding, which is that politicians, well, we give them power, but during their term, they discover that they don't have power, because lobbies take power away from them, but also because financial and economic circles deprive them from power, because they have more power than politicians. But this is something that we need to put an end to. Because of the crisis, we need to come out of this financial and economic orthodoxy that we've decided, from this weakness, this complacency that we've seen, that companies have decided to not pay taxes. Politicians need to really take over control over the financial sphere again. In 2008 as well as 2020, we saw that it was impossible to help people to not become poor overnight. And suddenly we see that billions of euros that we didn't have can be found. So we need to be able to make sure that each euro and each dollar is allocated to what is virtuous and not to what is toxic. Let's elect Nicolas Hulot as President of France. I'm not sure he wants that. Anyway. What was your question? Well, I thought you wanted to respond to what Nicolas said. Well, what you were saying is so true. Now, the power is not in the hands of politicians any longer. It's in the society. Now, when there is a march for climate, there are 50,000 people in the streets in France, in Paris. So we all need to fight. We all need to fight together. We need to go down in the streets. Somebody is raising a Turkish flag. That's another source of conflict. So we always expect everything from the politicians. We want them to lead us. But look at COP21. Everybody applauds and hugs one another, and you say it's great. People are honest when they sign the report, but in the report you don't see coal or gas or oil. These words are not used in the report. You don't see fossil energy. Otherwise, the member countries would not have signed the agreement. It's incredibly hypocritical. So we're signing reports and we know that they're absolutely worthless. I liked it when you talked about love. It's more lasting. There's nothing more lasting than love. So this loving conscience of the world is very important. It's the Pope who is saying that we need to get rid of cynicism and skepticism and believe in good actions. It's very important. So climate suffering, the climate, well, maybe hides other problems regarding biodiversity, life. Now, you have not given up. You know that you belong to nature, and it's very important because a lot of people think that they do not belong to nature. But we can take action. We listen to Jane Goodall. Things are still reversible. We can reverse the situation. Young people are committing themselves. Some other people that are not as young, they work on reforestation, creating gardens, everything that people can do. So a lot of things are possible. Now, what would you like to say to a young person who is 20 today? What is the century going to look like? What should you do in the 21st century? What would you like to tell these young people? First, I'd like to say sorry. I'd like to apologize because I belong to the generations that created the world of today. This religion of growth, this tyranny of growth is something that we've done throughout all our lives. So we apologize to you. And again, don't be afraid of the future. We are alive until the last day. And there's nothing more important in life than to be alive and to want to do something. And I believe that each one of you, it's not up to me to give you advice. I'm not clever enough to do that. You'll find what needs to be done yourself. Mohammed Yunus says two things. Man is not made to be employed by other people. Man is not made to be employed. It's very important, especially in Bangladesh, to be this resilient. And even more important, it's necessary to learn at school what you will succeed in, what you're good at, the job at which you will be good and happy to do this job. It's important to enjoy your job. So feel free to make your own choices. Don't be afraid to have impossible dreams and be brave, be courageous, and go for it. Now, in the world of today where uncertainty is unescapable and where the climate won't be stable, what can we say to young people? Now, we always ill at ease with the young because we have the feeling that we are leaving them with a burden, even though we are trying to make it as light as possible. There's a lot we want to say to young people. First, don't give up and don't give up to our worst enemy, which is resignation. As somebody said, it's too late to be pessimistic. Take action, commit yourselves, invent. But I'd like to come back to something important that Jan said. He said, be free. And I'd like to ask you to reflect about liberty, because sometimes we have wrong ideas about liberty. Very often people think it's the absence of rules, of limits. And one day one of my friends, a philosopher, Dominique Bourde, reminded me that etymologically, liberty is the rule that you set for yourself. And I'm saying this because we live in hyper-organized and sophisticated societies and those societies make us unable to reach limits, and we are always tempted to have futile desires, and therefore we don't see the beauty of life. We don't see what is essential in life. I think that youth, and I have children that are your age, I'm not saying you should not be in front of a screen sometimes, but don't spend all your time in front of screens. And in this society of consumption and addiction, try to take control. Try not to let others lead you to behaviors of compulsive, of impulsive consumption. So we all have more power than what we think. This commercial model that prevails, we can fight it. We can fight it. If we don't accept it, we can fight it. And we can also, on a daily basis, say no, refuse a number of things. We can inject a little bit of conscience in our daily lives and ask ourselves, is this useful? Is this virtuous? Is this necessary? And give a meaning to your lives. Commit yourselves. Become engaged. I've been hurt in all my life because I decided to be committed, but it's really something that is beautiful. Thank you very much. I believe that it's also important to really look at truth, to understand truth, to be brave enough to look at truth. Now, in the last report, well, one of the main climate problems is the loss of biodiversity. One of the latest reports of WWF is incredible. In 60 years, we lost 70% of what is living. It's unbelievable. We can all do that. We can stop using pesticides. We can eat organic food. It's super important. We've lost in France 80% of flying insects and 30% of our birds. I remember when I was a kid, I was going fishing with my grandfather, and we were picking grasshoppers. There are no more grasshoppers in my region. And eat less meat. Stop eating industrial meat. We have to help the farmers who work well, and we have to help them being paid a fair price. We need humanistic ecology. And that's all I want to say, actually. That's all I want to say. Well, that's not too bad.
Notion de...
So, following on this notion of freedom, which is fundamental, something Nicolas said, there is somebody, Etienne de la Boétie, wanted to be here. He was 19 in the 16th century, and he talked about a voluntary servitude. If we want to, get down on our knees in front of our vassals, we could do this. I think he died from the plague, very young, at 31. So that's also a path. We can resist at any age and in any society. So I thank the two of you very much. I wanted to say, with the Good Planet Foundation, we have a double-decker bus that is running on carbon at Place de la République in Caen. There's an escape game on carbon that you can play. Every French person has about, some 100 electrical appliances. So we have to think about how we can reduce our carbon imprint. So meet at the Place de la République in Caen for this double-decker bus. You've got the president of this association, Frédéric and François. I thank Nicolas Hulot and Yann Artus Bertrand. what has been happening here is very exciting and has been quite successful indeed. I would really like to hail some 100 people who were not able to come here, who are watching from the auditorium of the Abbey of Ladies. Here I would like to applaud them. As places are freed here, they can come and join us in this room. So please stay with us, Bertrand Badi and Denis Chessou. We're already at 8. I thought we'd only be with 4, but we've talked about some 50 types of suffering, and we also will talk about democracy and citizenship. So this forum takes place over 2 days of discussions, but Normandy Forum for Peace is something that has 4 chapters. That we have mediation, action, dialogue. There's a campus, there's one for culture and sciences, and also Normandy for science resources. We want to build, together with an international network, a type of library for peace, enabling researchers and some personalities, not always hearing the same people. We don't want a strictly French point of view or a strictly Western one, but we want to put ourselves in other people's shoes to understand this dynamic of peace, war, and conflict. We have a very good partnership with The Conversation. They have contributors throughout the world, and you will find all these contributions on our site, www.normandyforpeace. And there's also this, work done over longer time. There's the president of the region, Hervé Moret, and the president of CNRS and the University of Caen to work on this peace topic over the long term, to have these research networks working on this. So this brings together the very well-known lawyer Antonio Opoza, and also the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations on Human Rights and the Environment, David Boyd, and here he is through a video because he absolutely wanted to convey a message to us.
Hello from Canada. I'm Dr. David Boyd, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, and I'm delighted to be joining you at the Normandy World Peace Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, in the aftermath of the horrors of World War II, humanity created the United Nations and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights as institutions to ensure that there would never be such a catastrophic conflict again. 75 years later, we have successfully avoided any future world wars. And yet, humanity is engaged in a war of a different type, a war on nature. We live in the midst of a climate emergency, a biodiversity crisis. Pollution kills 7 to 9 million people every year, and our activities are causing a tidal wave of emerging infectious diseases, such as the COVID-19. It doesn't have to be this way. You know, human rights are a very powerful tool. Scientists are telling us that we need rapid, systemic, and transformative changes to overcome the global environmental crisis. And in the nick of time, humanity has discovered a new human right, one that was never imagined back in 1948, the right to live in a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This fundamental human right could mark a turning point, and that's why I'm calling on the United Nations to recognize that everyone, everywhere has this right. We know that human rights are powerful. We've seen them be used in the abolition of slavery, the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, the end of apartheid, the indigenous peoples movement, the LGBTQ+ movement. And so, my friends, I hope that you will join me in advocating for global recognition and implementation of the right to a healthy environment. As my friend Tony Oposa, the Normandy Chair for Peace, likes to say, we will not have peace on earth until we have peace with the earth. Thank you very much.
So this university chair is definitely addressing future generations. We have seen this throughout the morning. Youth is a very important element of Normandy for Peace. There are pedagogical projects that are conducted with youth throughout the year, including with the Institute for Peace, and we have its president here, and it has had a very good program, and we always talk about it. It is the walk, the global walk with the European Union. It is to heighten the awareness of youth to these issues because youth educate their parents. There are hundreds of youth who mobilize themselves throughout the 2019-2020 school year. They looked at the MDG 13 as defined by the UN. MDG 13 are measures related to fighting climate change. We are now lucky to have 4 representatives of Walk the Global Walk. So I would ask that Yann Arthus-Bertrand come up on stage and welcome them.
Alors, ils sont 4.
So we have 4 representatives, but they will be representing 1,100 of their fellow students. Here, take seats here and there. We have Maureen Roux, Simone Fribouret from the agricultural senior high, and Camille Saint-Saëns, Louis Marion, and Maxime Lemeur. So once again, 1,100 youth participated and worked on these days. The topic is one that is not yet taken up enough in society. These Millennium Development Goals are very important. These are part of the roadmap. You've worked on number 13, that is measures to fight climate change. So there has been an opposition between Philippines and here. He is a specialized lawyer on climate issues. In 1993, he won the first case on future generations. You are the future generations. The little child born here in Caen today. It's not just people who have yet to be born, but the ones who really are already here. He's done incredible work on deforestation in the Philippines. There were permits for deforestation more, bigger than the number of people in the Philippines. But we know that trees are very important. So he is someone who's incredible. His name is Yann Arthus-Bertrand, who has come back on stage, and he knows youth well. He has filmed faces of the entire world to once again show us that we are just one and the same humanity. So let's go. I don't know if it's Maureen or Simone who will be asking the first question. It's working? Perfect. Everything's working. Great. So Tony Oposa is with us. Okay, that's okay. You can stay here, Yann. That you will be able to stop. We don't know if it stops working. Stay up here on stage. We're improvising as we can. Tony Oposa, we have introduced you, leader of the chair of Normandy for Peace. You are anchored in the concerns of our youth. First question for Tony Oposa, live from the Philippines. Good morning. You have updated this intergenerational responsibility concept, but people of our age are very touched by climate change. And with your experience, how do you think youth of our age can fight this efficiently, and how can we show our solidarity efficiently?
Thank you for that question and for the honor of sharing with you our thoughts. Greetings from the Normandy Chair for Peace. first we will understand that we will have peace on earth when we have peace with the earth. When we understand that, then we will take care of the earth. And justice. What is justice? It is getting what you deserve. Do you, my young friends, and your generation deserve the earth that we are leaving behind? But there is something that you must think about. The things that make our life comfortable today will tomorrow make our lives miserable. Do you use running water? Yes. Do you use material things? Yes. Do you use motor vehicles, electricity? Yes. But when you use running water, you waste water. When you use material things, you throw away garbage. When you use motor vehicles, you burn oil. And when you use electricity, you heat the air. So what do you need to do? I was listening earlier to the speakers. We need a climate of change. What we are seeing now is climate change. But my dear friends, what we need is a climate of change. Real change. And change does not begin with government. It begins with our own heart. In each of our hands lies the power to give justice to the present and future generation. My friends, there are 3 things that you can do to make it fun and to address the problem. Number 1, to act locally, think about putting up food gardens. Food gardens. It will ensure food supply, it will eradicate hunger, it will cool the air, and it will even absorb carbon dioxide. And most of all, it will reconnect us, human beings, to nature and to each other. Road sharing is another one. That roads are not meant to move. Roads are not meant to move cars. Roads are meant to move people. So roads are not supposed to be all for cars. It should be. It's called road sharing, like what Paris is doing. Very good. And rainwater catchments, because rainwater catchment ponds, water is going to become a very serious challenge in your lifetime. You begin to please think about it now. We should not waste water at all. And there is also a group of young people around the world who are initiating a legal action.
Alors, on a déjà eu...
We have already had a small bit of Tony's roadmap, talking about opening up these food gardens, taking into consideration water. Michel said that at the end of oil, well, we won't be at the end of the world, but when it's the end of water, yes, it will be the end of the world. So we have to see what we all can do. I think could we not boost the link to try to get Tony back? Oh, it is working, okay.
Ça fonctionne peut-être que d'un seul côté.
Perhaps it's only working on one side. Tony?
Oui. Alors peut-être la deuxième question, Clément, tout simplement.
Perhaps the second question, we can show it.
Comment pouvez-vous faire passer les enjeux devant les enjeux... excusez-moi, je reprends. Comment pouvez-vous faire passer les enjeux environnementaux avant les enjeux économiques au niveau des acteurs locaux sans subir les représailles des grandes industries. Merci.
Oh, sorry. How can you ensure that environmental issues will be a priority over economic issues without having to suffer reprisals from major economic actors?
Yes. First, we should begin to reframe the idea of the environment, that the environment is about the sources of life, of land, air, and water. When we understand that, then we will do everything in our power to protect it. We should make even the economic, there is no conflict between nature and business. The nature of business must be the business of nature. It requires an entire mind shift. Think about nature and business being one and the same. May I repeat, the nature of business must be the business of nature.
Voilà, donc
Okay, so thank you very much, Tony Opoza.
et bravo.
And I also want to congratulate you on the struggle that you are waging in the Philippines. You are a lawyer and a researcher in the Philippines, and we see that within states there are 130 states that have been heightened. Now we have to also heighten the awareness of judges. But this is coming, and this is something that's absolutely crucial. So, I don't know who wants to address this or answer this question, but perhaps somebody could give some kind of answer, Jan. Well, he's a star. What he's doing is great. He's very known in environmental circles. Not everyone knows him, but again, the foundation, Good Planet, we have a kit. Have you seen the kit? 17 posters on the MDGs sent to all the schools in France. Youth, have you seen this? You have to look at the documentation center. You should be able to see these. We have sent these to all schools. We came up with 80,000 kits. It seems that the youth do not know this on essential things, women's rights, the 17 MDGs. These are maybe utopic, but I think that utopia is just a premature reality. Well, it's just a dream that has not yet come true. Is that it? That's what utopia is. Thank you, and thank you. Thank you for having represented briefly, yes, but we have other types of suffering to be evoked. Then we will talk about Francophonie as well, but we would like to thank you for the work that you have done, for having represented your friends. There are quite a few of them, so thank you, and thank you to Tony Opoza. So you can head out this way. Thank you once again, Jan. Thank you very much. Since the beginning of this morning, we have been talking about suffering and all different types of suffering. Now we're going to talk about societal and citizen suffering. We have seen in recent years an increase in the number of protest movements throughout the world. This is something that was part of Bertrand Bady's statement, and it's also something he elaborates on in his latest publication. We have the Yellow Vests in France, the protest movement following the death of George Floyd, expressed through the Black Lives Matter movement, feminist claims, but also the fight for democracy in Hong Kong, or popular mobilization in marches for climate. Just a few examples of the fever that has spread throughout our societies. And we see these threats, Frédéric, they are changing and moving in order to get a better idea, a better grasp on them. In this, we are working with the European Parliament in a peace partnership. We have the Normandy Index of the Normandy Parliament, and this is an index that has come out this year. It's particularly interesting because it looks on the conflictuality rate throughout the world through some 10 criteria to try to best anticipate, to prevent conflicts, to see what it might be somewhat invisible, something that could lead countries over the tipping point where there could be an emergence of conflicts. And we could also look at where things are going better. It's very useful. And it's also a tool that must be used by the European members of Parliament when they are debating topics. Together with Hervé Morin at the United Nations, we also had a meeting where we saw that there was, with the UNDP, the Human Development Index, and we saw a correlation between the human development and the level of conflictuality. So this index is online on the site of the European Parliament and on Normandy for Peace's site. It is quite refined. It looks at intermediary states that go from perfect peace to total war. Don't hesitate to consult it. If you want to know more about this, there will be a debate this afternoon on the role of the European Union on the international scene. Europe's role is something we will talk about in the last debate this morning on citizen suffering. And so now we will give the floor back to Denis Chessou. I thank you both very much. So you have presented this European and Normandy for Peace Index. So, citizens suffering, Pascal Perrineau, please come up and join us. We have the pleasure of having with us online we have Pascal Perrineau, who is a political scientist and professor at political science, and he knows about all the different political levels. He is someone very well known. There's Enrico Letta, who is the former president of the Council of Ministers and president of the Institute of Jacques Delors, and the dean of the International Affairs School of Political Science, Paris. So we will begin with Pascal Perrineau to set the scene, to talk about these different types of suffering, this social anger, protest movements. Please, you have the floor, Pascal. Good morning, everyone. To everyone, thank you for inviting me to participate in this collective debate and the analysis of this litany of suffering, which we've been looking at one after the other since this morning. So we see in our democracies, whether they be pluralistic, which we had reinvented after the Second World War on the ruins of dictatorial regimes, we see how this democracy is somewhat at the end of a cycle. It is contested as to its efficiency. Much was said about the efficiency of these systems to rise to challenges such as climate, seeking peace, fighting social injustice, etc. The symptoms are very numerous when we look at citizens suffering. There are many things here involved. The strength of weak signals, for example, increased abstentions in votes. Now we are thrilled when we, at the European level, had elections, whereas half of the voters didn't show up. Everybody thought, wow, this is 50% turnout. That's extraordinary. At the latest municipal elections, we said it was the COVID effect, but that 55%. So There are phenomena such as strikes, civic strikes, a distancing from the political scene, and there are ever increasingly strong signs of protest. Some citizens, instead of withdrawing, are remaining within the political system, but in order to protest it, to really cry out, decry the system. They don't want to be part of a system to govern. No, that's not what they're interested in. No, they don't want to say yes to something. They want to say no to the system as it is now. And this is the general impetus we see. Just look at the latest European elections, but this is a global phenomenon. This impetus of everything we're talking about, populism or national populism, and all political stripes have been affected, from the left to the right, going through new types of populism, such as the Italian type, the Cinque, the five-star movement. So here, there's a real force of this protest movement. And what's interesting is that for some years now, this mutation also affects what we call social movements. Social movements, this expression of social suffering, has always existed. But these movements were rather typical. The major unions, which we knew, major typical demonstrations on the 1st of May. Well, not many people show up to the 1st of May. However, there are new social movements that don't have a very specific structure. They're like volcanoes. They erupt here and there, and they emerge. They are no longer the general topics of the 50s and 60s and 70s. It is, let's say, in Lebanon to protest the increase in taxes on tobacco. In France, it's the increase in tax on fuel by the yellow vests. So there's these movements that are totally horizontal. Yes, they are expressing social suffering, but it's a global phenomenon. That's what you're saying. Indeed, it's a global phenomenon. But what you have to see is that this type of movement has a really hard time finding a political expression. So here we've been racking our brains to say, how do we, we have to radically change things. We have to get some political imagination in power to get to a different world. So we've changed, our society has completely changed. Well, I wouldn't quite say it has totally changed. Well, I won't say we have completely changed. Let's just say there's an old world that's still there, and there's a new world having a hard time coming about. Someone would say, what's a crisis? It's when the old world is dying and the new world is hesitating to emerge. And in between, you have monsters. Yes, at that point, monsters surface. There are authoritarian regimes. There's a return to nationalism, extreme nationalism. Some attack democracy and rule of law. They strike at the heart. There are many different phenomena of this type, but also in what's being invented, there are some complex things. Because this protest movement, this social protest, is calling into question democracy itself. They have to think of, what's in the sun and what's in the shade in these movements. I was struck by the Yellow Vest movement in France. Recently, I came up with some cartoons on the Yellow Vest because they wrote a lot of things on the walls. And in French suburbs, there was a Yellow Vest saying, "We do not want to talk. We do not want to discuss anything." And an entire swath of the Yellow Vest movement was typical of this. Because in democratic systems, well, if we don't want to talk, we've been talking about compromise, negotiation, sitting around the table to try to come up with a new world. But when you don't want to discuss things, that makes it a little bit more difficult. And in France especially, this corresponds to a certain temperament where some think democracy is incompatible with any form of representation by a political person. In Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract, he says the general will cannot be represented. And you see, we have people around us. Okay, so what do you do with people who do not want to be represented? How do you engage in a dialogue with them to come up with this tomorrow, this new world we so desperately need? So, Pascal Perrineau, we hear there are these old actors like laborers, and they feel left out. And we're in a crisis, and they don't know where they stand. There's this globalization, which is not that new, but it has accelerated. And then there's cultural globalization. And that's perhaps part of citizen suffering, because people are kind of lost in all of this. Indeed, this suffering can, lead to certain things. We hope something good, but we have to remain lucid, and lucid right to the end. So, if you look at this old world that we see dying out and this new world hesitating to come about, when you look at this dying world, well, when you're in danger of disappearing, you can have very, very strong reactions. And in fact, listening this morning, we heard people are calling for a radical change. We heard that, post-war until, there was this industrial society up until the 80s. We've had a lot of growth, but growth has given a lot, especially to workers' working conditions. But now we have to change all that. We have to rethink society, the post-industrial society. That's what has to be rethought. And here there are major players who have created this industrial society and who have benefited from this industrial society, and who today are calling out in great distress. I'm thinking of workers, the entire working class, these people who have benefited from the state of providence and growth rates which we experienced in what we call the 30 glorious years. This is a world that's now disappearing, and now we must recognize that most of these environments don't want to disappear. They feel that they've been left aside. They feel that they are victims of many different fractures, territorial, social, economic fractures. And they often have chosen to engage in protest, this, national populist type of protest. And if we are going to clarify this, we see a whole bunch of different environments that are very far from that utopia, which we have said is no longer a choice, but a necessity. And if we want this necessary utopia to become a reality, we all have to be headed in the same direction. Because if it's one part of the society against another, we will not get far. And from a democratic point of view, there's a real problem. Because this democracy, as we have known it, which satisfied us for decades, this democracy seems completely unequipped for the task. So what's happening as a result? 3 scenarios. First, we are dreaming of these wounds, of bumps. There could be authoritarian regimes which would allocate resources differently. Even within the green movement, there's an authoritarian, saying with democracy it'll be difficult. Let's maybe have an authoritarian regime. You have to know that in France, at the political science, we have French fracture. 1 out of 3 French say that a strong man in parliament would be good. That's 33%, and these are not some old farts who miss this Vichy regime. We're talking about youth who support this authoritarian regime. The second solution, one which they haven't known, in fact, they haven't lived through. Second solution, the technocratic government, the old French, the Saint-Simon dream. Well, people are becoming more complicated, so we'll ask the technocrats to administrate. And you have in quite a few political formulae, perhaps those even in power. What's Macronism? It's maybe Saint-Simeonism. Perhaps there is this attempt that is now being attempted. And the third, and I'm open to hear everything, it is to democratize democracy. That is, to set up a new type of democracy which would not be the typical representative democracy, but one that would be like Dominique Rousseau talks about, a democracy which is continued. It just doesn't have just elections, but it has truly participatory democracy, and does not forget that democracy is also direct democracy. That is to directly ask the people every once in a while what it thinks.
Merci beaucoup, Pascal Perrineau.
Thank you, Pascal Perrineau, for this outlook and your analysis on the suffering of citizens. And Enrico Letta knows this very well. He's probably going to take a European perspective. Bertrand, very quickly, yes. We're talking about peace, and related to that, I'd like to add that these new social movements are global, transnational, and international. They are developing everywhere in Latin America, Europe, Asia, Africa. It's an incredible phenomenon, and they are also transnational, and that's very important in terms of international relations and the future of peace, because they spread one with the others, and they borrow one from the others. There's a community of slogans like go away, and you have the word system, questioning the system, and this is used as a scapegoat in Beirut, Paris, and Algiers, and that's quite extraordinary. It's completely new. Like the Arab Spring in 2011, it impacted European movements. This is really this transnationalism of contest, and these movements are also transnational. They are players in international relations. What is the referee of conflicts today in the Middle East, in Lebanon, Iraq? Well, social movements. When Trump executed General Soleimani, well, it led to this. And when the Tehran government did this silly mistake, which was to shoot down the Ukrainian aircraft, the same people blamed the government. So the pace of international relations is given by social movements, even more than US sanctions, and that's quite extraordinary. Enrico Letta, thank you for being with us. You are at home in Italy. You're the Dean of the School of International Affairs at Sciences Po in Paris, president of the Jacques Delors Institute. You love Europe, but you also criticize it. You're a convinced European. Now, in the reasons of anger, we talked about globalization, and what's extremely important is the acceleration of globalization. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be with you, even though it's only online. I was very glad to listen to Pascal Perrineau and Bertrand Badi. I'm sorry for not being physically present, but recent restrictions between France and Italy have obliged me to stay in Italy this week now. The acceleration of globalization that you mentioned, for me, is the main issue, because now this acceleration leads to a very strong gap between the economy. We talk about the industry 4.0, our personal lives, which are probably around 5.0, and the institutions and institutional life that has remained at 1.0. So it's a gap that is not tolerable, and the three scenarios that Pascal described are the right ones. I think that the only possible one is the last one, and we need to work on it. But we need to take into account this general phenomenon of the acceleration of globalization and this fear that we won't be able to control new technologies, the arrival of artificial intelligence, protection of personal data. Well, in Europe, technological tools are either American or Chinese. The Chinese manage this with the market. The Americans do it with the... sorry, it's the opposite. The Americans manage it through the market and the Chinese through the state, and we are in the middle. We are afraid for our data. We are afraid that AI will manage this in a way we don't like. So the problem is what we expect. The world of before was a world where things were not going so well. Today we live much better. We have many better things in our lives. We live longer, and Michel Serres wrote about the world of before very well. But we live better. So what are we missing? Expectations, or being certain about our expectations. In the past, we're living in a society where the expectation of a slow, gradual, but sure progress led to the fact that the middle-class families were certain about the future. They had a sure future. You could go up the ladder one step by one step. And today things can collapse overnight. You have no visibility on your future, so therefore you're unhappy and you contest. Now, it's probably also the role of politicians in this world where people don't have certainties any longer to manage these transition periods. They can't set a course because they don't have the necessary visibility, but they can manage the transition periods. It's their role. Yes, and that's why Europe in 2020 will remain in history like in 1989, because in March and April Europe almost blew up. And with the leadership of France and Germany, it was able to issue this major recovery plan. And if it had not done this, Europe would not be today the Europe we knew. It would have been impossible, because the cohesion between countries would have stopped and blown off as well, and many countries would have gone through a drop in their growth and a rise in unemployment that would have been a disaster. So Europe was able to launch this plan. It needs to be implemented, of course, but I think that this opportunity goes hand in hand with a second one. I think the next 18 months will be extremely interesting, because Europe has two great opportunities in front of it now. To make sure first that all this money that is going to be used is perceived by European citizens as European money, and to make them understand that Europe is close to its citizens and helps them. I'd like this money to have the European flag on it. And the second question is turnout at elections. the turnout of citizens. There's going to be a conference on the future of Europe. It has not started yet because of COVID. It's going to start at the end of the year and end under the French presidency of the European Union in 2022. This conference will probably be the greatest global exercise to attempt to launch scenario 3 that Pascal referred to democratize democracy, because there will be a participation of the citizens in this exercise. In the past, it was only for diplomats or politicians. Now, citizens will be involved, as well as diplomats and politicians. We will all be together, and there will be concrete proposals to try and come out of this stalemate in which we find ourselves. There are many possibilities. We could have transnational lists in the European Parliament. The idea for the President of the European Commission to be directly elected, like in France, when you elect your President of the Republic. There are many ideas. It's the right time. It's a crucial time to make European citizens players in European life again. We talk about it in Normandy during this initiative, and that's very important in my view, to be here and to talk about the history of recovery and to relaunch democracy in Europe. And France plays a very important role. Now, democratize democracy, make democracy more ecological. That's also dear to the heart of Hervé Morin. Now, what solutions do you have in mind to attract the acceptance of the people? Isn't the position of Europe before COVID, doesn't it give new impetus sometimes to populism? Because this purely financial vision of the EU, this is not something that makes citizens and populations dream. So how can we become united to give a new necessary momentum to the EU, which is considered as a financial Europe? I'm going to say something that is maybe not politically correct. Well, we are in Normandy. It was liberated by the English, but we need to benefit from something that was very negative, Brexit. We cried, we were unhappy. We thought it would be a great economical and political problem. But the fact that our British friends are not within the European Council any longer, where they were blocking every kind of progress regarding social Europe in particular, well, this is positive. I think we need to see what is positive in all this. In this recovery plan, the next generation recovery plan, there's a huge social part on unemployment, health, young people. It's, in a way, Jacques Delors' dream, who was always fighting with Margaret Thatcher, who was blocking all this with her right of veto. And, well, this was not the case before. There was no social Europe. Now we have this possibility because the British veto does not exist any longer. So in the recovery plan, there are many initiatives in that direction. And I'd like to conclude with a proposal that I'd like to make that we developed with Jacques Delors and that I think is essential, which is the House of Young People and Education, the issue of young people and education. Now, today, families that have money, either in France, Italy, Germany, they send their children to study abroad, which is very useful to understand the world. But you need money to do that. You have to pay. It's not covered by the national education system. It's not free of charge, and all this is dividing up these societies between families that have money and others that do not. So our proposal is to do an Erasmus for school children paid by EU money, and to make compulsory a period of a few months when you're 15, 17, 16, to make it compulsory to study abroad even though they are in Pisa, which is the most beautiful city in the world. Of course, it's my hometown. But all this must be done with European money, and it must put all our young at the same level to make sure that all of them should benefit from this opening and understand that they are in Europe everywhere, in all countries and all cities. It would be a great progress. Thank you, Enrico Letta. Well, if 500 million Europeans support this, as the room accepted your proposal, well, of course, we have a lot to do, but it's positive. Well, thank you for these reflections. Well, we are animals that need to imagine the futures. We can only support this proposal. Thank you, Mr. Pascal Perrineau, as well, and thank you, Mr. Letta. Thank you for this discussion. You're going to stay with us, because in a minute you'll be able to have a dialogue with the Secretary General of the Francophonie, who is honoring us with her presence today. It's raining very hard outside, so we are fine inside, and later on, for the lunch break, of course, the sun will shine. A few words about our adventure, Normandy for Peace. Since the beginning, we've started a very nice partnership with the Institute for the Audiovisual, and we are convinced that the knowledge of the past through audiovisual archives is very important to know about the future. Ina last year gave us a very nice gallery of Nobel Peace Prize. This year it is the role of women in the building of peace that is highlighted. 10 women, 10 portraits in 10 web docs designed especially for our forum that we are showing you as a preview here, but that you'll find on our website as well, and on Ina's website. One of them is about an American personality that is now a symbol of militant combat, Angela Davis.
Incarnation du Black Power dans une Amérique en proie à la ségrégation raciale, Angela Davis milite depuis les années 60 pour la justice sociale. Sa détermination,
her determination and afro hair that she's wearing as a fighting helmet has transformed her into an icon. The interpreter is going to try and sum up the subtitles. In 1970, Angela Davis is 26, and FBI is after her. She's an active member of the revolutionary group Black Panthers and is on the list of the 10 most looked for criminals in the country and inspires fear. I was publicly characterized as one of the most dangerous criminals in the United States. It was an open invitation for anybody to kill me. She was accused of taking part in a bloody hostage-taking operations. So petitions after 16 months in prison and demonstrations to support her by intellectuals and artists worldwide. Angela Davis is said not guilty. She's acquitted, following a verdict by 12 white juries. She becomes the symbol of the fight for civil rights and makes people even more afraid than before because she represents aggressiveness, but it's not to the detriment of tenderness. Absolutely not. If I fight, it is for a world where people can feel softness and tenderness. To understand her fight, you have to go back to the source. She was born in 1944 in a state where the laws of racial segregation are applied and where there is the Ku Klux Klan. Well, Angela Davis wishes for the world to be softer. I was born in the South. I spent all my childhood there. And the first thing that I will remember all my life was the bombing of houses, explosions. My father had weapons. We needed weapons. We had been threatened. We had to be able to defend ourselves. She was revolted since childhood, but she does not let anger blind her and finds the weapons which, combined with a natural aura, will make her a leader. I represent a section of the feminist fight. After high school, Angela Davis studies philosophy, whereas Martin Luther King has just been assassinated and the police violence is raging. She's evolving her action plan and bases it on Marxist thought. I talk to you on behalf of the victims. She's black, she's a woman, she's a homosexual of modest origin. She does not belong to any group and is against all kinds of oppressions of the Americans over the Vietnamese, rich over poor, whites over blacks, men over women. She's been fighting for decades, and it's probably her secret, her ability to resist to all kinds of violence without ceasing to be revolted. Resist to violence in a violent world. Well, if you want an example of courage, there are many examples of courage daily, but Angela Davis is a very good embodiment of like Louise Michel, Yolande de Gouges, at other eras, in other eras. We need those landmarks. They are unescapable in all generations. Louise Mushikiwabo, please join us. You're the Secretary General of Francophonie, OIF. Secretary General of the International Organization of Francophonie. I'm not going to ask you to conclude because many things were said, but I'd like your vision as Secretary General of Francophonie. We thought it was really necessary to have your views at this third Normandy for Peace Forum on these movements of anger that you know very well about, on all these waves of anger that hits the French-speaking world, but also the rest of the world. What reflections does that inspire you? Please, you have the floor. Thank you. I'm very happy to take part in this forum for the first time. I'm more or less the new Secretary General of the organization that groups together several countries that share the French language, 54 governments and nations, which are full members, and 34 which are observers. We are represented on all continents, and of course it gives us a vision, an outlook on the world. And I enjoyed very much listening earlier on to words of wisdom, of warning regarding what's going on in the world today. What is clear is that the world, the French-speaking world, is part of the world. And this world is suffering from disruptions today. The movements of anger are alike, but they are also different because these movements come from national and regional situations and circumstances. But there is a general discontent. The organization I represent includes 32 African countries. We shared 19 members with the European Union. And in my view, and according to what I see, mainly in the French-speaking world, our citizens feel that nobody is listening to them. They share this concern. And very often they show this anger when there are political changes, when there are elections, or simply when citizens create new organizations. And these movements are taking growing importance because they are not very much structured, as we said before. These movements use very cleverly the era of digital today. Everywhere in the world, in the most distant places, the French-speaking family knows how to communicate and communicate this anger everywhere in Africa, in many countries, in different parts of the continent. We had the Dégage movement or other movements launched by the citizens. In Romania, very important member of Francophonie, there was a movement against corruption that developed along the years. So I believe that what's going on in the world today is really calling our attention. We are involved in our daily work on political issues, on issues related to education, on digital more and more, on the education of girls and women. And for me, these situations that we see in the French-speaking world are important for us, and they require from us to take our time and think carefully. I like very much this idea of democratizing democracy. We need to make sure that our citizens feel that we are listening to them. It's the main problem. And we see it from a political angle and also from an economic one. And we understand today that in the whole world, in the French-speaking world, we need to take time to listen to our citizens and start a dialogue with them. So this lack of listening is also a part of this feeling of humiliation that Nicolas Hulot was mentioning earlier on. Now, for you, what are the priorities of the combat for women and by women? Well, I've personally been convinced for a long time, at least since the beginning of my professional life, that a society that does not give its real value to women is a society that is taking the risk of going backwards. Woman is an important element for transforming societies in depth, and this is a reality. In the Francophonie organization, we focus on two aspects regarding women. First, education, then economic empowerment of women. We are convinced that with these two aspects and other aspects as well related with the rights of women, the fight against violence, well, of course, all these aspects are important as well. But in my view, when a woman is educated, when a woman does not need to beg, she can fight for her rights that are so important. So in the French-speaking world today, there are two countries undergoing a crisis, Lebanon and Mali in Western Africa. And one thing we do in these two countries is provide support to women who have lost their means of survival. I just started in Paris the Francophonie Fund for Women to be able to go and meet those women. You know, women are clever, they are ingenious. Even if you give them very small resources, they can take care of themselves, of their children, of their extended family, of the community, of their country, and of the world. So since we can't do everything, I'm convinced that education is a right. But it's not only a right, it's also a tool, a weapon for women. But it's also important that women should be able to live without having to beg. So with these two things, we are convinced that the rights of women can make progress. I've worked in Tunisia for a number of years, in North Africa. I'm from Rwanda. I come from a country where more than 60% of the members of parliament are women, from a country that was very much hurt by a genocide, and I know because of the experience of my own country that it would have been impossible from Rwanda to start again without giving this place to women.
Because there has been a significant conflict resolution thanks to women. I was saying that you have been able to settle your conflict, which was very violent rather, thanks to women. Women in Rwanda, well, that's a really nice and long story and history, if you will. The experience of my country is that in such a disastrous situation, the fact that Rwanda, the capital of the city, that is the #1 city, had as its mayor a woman. The police commissioner in that difficult time was a woman. The fact that at the head of one of our most important banks was a woman, this did not just give a signal about the capacity of women, which never hurts, but it also led to a lot of respect on the part of men for women. It also changed the mentality, especially of boys. Women, who were in positions that were traditionally reserved for men, and they did an outstanding job. They fought for the rights of everyone in society. Women were working for everyone. So, to my mind, there is no doubt that in this change, in this discussion with regard to the future, with regard to the transformations underway in society, this shaking up, women must have a central role. Thank you very much, Louise Mushikiwabo. So, working at the roots with education and emancipation, you talked about, we've had a whole list. I know that your organization is working for peace. That is your work. You're doing it on a daily basis. So, before we go out and see the sun, because people keep saying that it always rains here, you've got nice weather and water. Well, Hervé Morin is saying there's less and less water, but thank you very much, Louise Mushikiwabo, for your testimony, and also we want to thank Denis Chessou. Thank you very much. Thank you to Denis Chessou, who stuck to the time frame. And as Louise Mushikiwabo has, what she has said has told us that this has inspired us, and we will be having a forum in partnership with Elle on building peace. And there is a very nice supplement of Elle, the edition of 11 September, Normandy for Peace, which highlights exceptional women. And there is one who is just on my right, Frédérique Bedos. Feel free to applaud her, because she's also in this supplementary edition of Elle, talking about the Imagine project. So congratulations, Frédérique. This is something that warms my heart and that of my teams. We really want to focus on the role of women, and we heard Louise Mushikiwabo emphasizing this. The role of women in conflict resolution is crucial. women's rise in power, and it's something that can be felt tangibly at all levels of power. And 2020 is the year of the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Resolution 1325, where we talk about women, peace, and security, and the connection among them. And here at this forum, you will have the exceptional testimony of our guest of honor, Barbara Hendricks. Please don't miss this event. It will be here in this tent. After that L Forum, there will be many debates, all very interesting. We'll talk about the Amazon, about hydro diplomacy, and also we will talk about the post-COVID world. What's new this year, we have nocturnal events at 8 p.m. We have Kev, a documentary film nominated for an Oscar and was supported by the Normandy region. Not just the screening of this film, which it's The Cave. It is a makeshift hospital which is run by a pediatrician and a friend of Mani Balou, who will be here. The filmmaker will also be here from Germany. So that is starting at 8 o'clock tonight. Please don't miss that. This will be an exceptional time. So we have to continue following the sanitary rules. We have a specific instruction, but from the prefecture, you have to sit down to eat. So enjoy your lunch, enjoy your afternoon, and have a good forum. Thank you.